I'm not expecting anyone to believe this. Hell, I'm not even sure I do anymore. My name is Alaric Vin. Yeah, that Vin, the archaeologist who went on that whole thing a few years back that academia laughed off like I was pitching a new Indiana Jones sequel. This happened in late October, maybe 5 years ago. I was living alone in a rental cottage just outside Innsmouth, Massachusetts. Quiet, foggy town, mostly fishermen and retirees. I've been on academic leave since my last dig went sideways in Turkey. University politics, funding pulled, my reputation shredded. I was basically a joke in my field. Broke, bitter, and borderline obsessed with proving my theories were worth something. That's when the letter showed up. No return address, just old paper folded into itself like it had been sealed in a bottle. Inside was a map, hand-drawn, aged, stained, showing the coast around Innsmouth with markings I didn't recognize. And one phrase scribbled in a tight, slanted hand: "He dreams in the deep." I must have stared at it for a full hour. There was something about those words that felt heavy, like they weren't meant to be read out loud. The ink looked almost alive in certain light. I know how that sounds, but when you've spent your life chasing fragments of dead civilizations, you learn to trust that gut feeling when something ancient brushes against you. I should have burned that letter. I should have walked away, but I didn't. Instead, I packed up my gear, some maps, a field journal, my old compass, and a digital recorder that hadn't worked properly since '09, and drove straight into town. It was gray and misting that day, like the clouds were too tired to fully rain. I stopped by the dock to ask around about the areas marked on the map. Most folks gave me that look, the one where they pretend they didn't hear you just to avoid answering. One guy, though, an older fisherman with eyes too pale for his face, muttered something like, "Some doors don't open back up once you see what's inside." He wouldn't say more. His name tag read Caleb, and his hands shook like he'd been cold for years. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was close to something, a real discovery, something that might make all those years of mockery worth it. That night, I stayed in the attic room of an old boarding house called the Gull Spine. Cheap, creaky, and smelled like rust and seawater, but had a view of the coastline. I laid the map out under a dim lamp, trying to line up the symbols with landmarks I'd seen earlier. At some point, I must have fallen asleep with it still open on my lap. That's when the first dream came. I was underwater, but I wasn't drowning. Everything was silent except for a deep, pulsing hum, like a heartbeat slowed down 100 times. I saw spires, towers twisted like coral and bone, and something massive moving in the distance, not swimming, just existing. It felt like the water itself was watching me. When I woke up, my mouth was full of salt, and my fingernails were cracked and blackened, like I'd been clawing at stone in my sleep. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I bit my nails in my sleep. Maybe I was grinding my teeth so hard I tasted blood. But I knew it wasn't that. Something about the dream had weight, like it had taken more from me than just rest. The next morning, I headed out toward one of the marked locations, a jagged outcropping called Devil's Tooth by the locals. I had to hike a few miles along the shore, weaving through tide pools and patches of seaweed that clung to my boots like they didn't want me to go. When I reached it, the tide was out, revealing a stone arch that looked wrong. It wasn't erosion, it wasn't natural. It was too smooth, too precise. At the base of the arch were carvings, deep, spiral patterns, and eyes with no pupils. I traced one with my finger, and the rock felt warm. It pulsed once like it had a heartbeat. I stumbled back, nearly losing my footing on the wet rocks. As I turned to leave, I saw something that made my stomach flip. A seal, or at least something shaped like a seal, was washed up on the shore nearby. Its skin was slick with an oil-like sheen, and its eyes weren't eyes. They were stitched shut with some kind of black fiber, and across its belly, symbols had been carved into the flesh. Not random wounds, intentional. The same spirals and pupilless eyes I'd just seen. I looked around, half expecting someone to pop out of the rocks and say it was all a prank. But the beach was empty, dead quiet, except for the waves, which sounded less like surf and more like breathing. I took photos with my phone, but the screen kept glitching. The image would twist like it was bending around something that wasn't there. When I tried recording a voice memo to document everything, all I got was static, and beneath that, faintly, a sound like gurgling whispers. That night, back at the boarding house, I didn't even try to sleep. I sat on the floor with a map, tracing each marked point, and realized they weren't random. They formed a spiral, wide, jagged, pointing in towards something just offshore. Something deep. I started cross-referencing with tide charts, historical records, even old whaler logs I had copies of. That spiral, if you followed it far enough, ended at a trench, a spot where sonar scans had failed for decades. No one's ever mapped it properly. Locals call it the Hollow. I started noticing changes in the town. People moved differently, slower. Some stopped blinking altogether. The woman at the diner I'd eaten at the first day, she used to have a lazy eye. Now, both eyes stared perfectly straight, glassy, like she was underwater. And they were all humming, quietly, almost imperceptibly, but in unison. It was the same rhythm from my dream. I asked the innkeeper, Mrs. Yarrow, if there had been any strange happenings lately, disappearances, odd animal behavior, anything. And she just smiled, real slow, and said, "Some things return to the shore when they're called properly." I packed a bag right then. I was scared, genuinely scared. But I also knew that if I left without answers, I'd never stop wondering, never sleep again. Something was building, and I needed to see it through. The next morning, I went to the public library, one of those old buildings that smells like rotting paper and dust-covered secrets. I was hoping to dig up anything that could confirm what I was seeing. Tucked in the local history section, I found a handwritten journal wrapped in oilcloth and signed, no title, just pages and pages of meticulous observations. It dated back to the early 1900s, written by someone who'd lived in the same boarding house I was staying in. The entries described the same symbols, the same spiral of locations, and references to those who sing beneath the waves. One phrase kept appearing over and over, scrawled into the margins like compulsion. He waits, but not in silence. My hands were shaking by the time I got to the final entry. It ended mid-sentence, followed by a smear of ink and what looked like dried blood. I left the library in a daze, clutching the journal like it was the only thing keeping me tethered to reality. The sky had darkened unnaturally fast, clouds boiling low over the ocean. I heard it again, that hum, now louder, pulsing in my chest like it was syncing with my heartbeat. As I made my way down toward the docks, I noticed more people standing still along the street, all facing the water, not blinking, not speaking, just waiting. I ducked into an alley, heart pounding, and realized I was starting to understand the words in the hum. Not just feel them, comprehend them. The language wasn't human, but it made sense. And that terrified me more than anything. I wasn't supposed to understand it. No one was. At dusk, I returned to Devil's Tooth. The tide was lower than I'd ever seen it, revealing more of the shoreline that had been hidden for centuries. The arch was fully exposed now, and beyond it, a descending path, not stairs, but a natural slope that spiraled downward into the surf. The ocean pulled back like it was holding its breath. I followed the path, half in a trance, the hum growing louder with every step. At the bottom, there was a cavern, or maybe a temple, carved directly into the stone beneath the waves. The walls were covered in those same ice symbols, except here, they moved. Not like illusions or tricks of light. They shifted, slowly, following me, blinking without lids. I don't remember entering. One moment I was standing outside. The next I was inside, the air thick and briny like I was breathing the ocean itself. Inside, they were waiting. Not people, not anymore. They had human forms, but their skin had the sheen of fish scales, and their mouths were too wide, filled with needle-like teeth. At the center of the chamber was a pool, black as ink, bubbling without heat. And they were chanting, not loud, not aggressive, just rhythmic like lullabies for something ancient. I couldn't move. My feet wouldn't obey. I was just stuck, trembling as the pool began to glow faintly. Not with light, with presence. Something was coming, rising. The walls began to vibrate, and I swear I felt something press against the inside of my skull, like fingers testing the softness of my thoughts. I didn't see it, not fully, but I felt it, and that was worse. Like my mind was being folded inward to make room for something else. Then something snapped. Not in the world, in me. I don't know if it was instinct or just raw panic, but I screamed, loud, primal, broken. And in that moment, the chant faltered, just for a breath. That was all I needed. I turned and ran, half crawling up the slick stone slope, the hum now shrieking in my ears like metal tearing through bone. Behind me, I heard splashes, wet footsteps. They were following, but not fast. Like they knew I wouldn't get far. I don't remember getting back to the town. Just flashes, the sound of gulls overhead, the taste of salt in my throat, a group of children watching me from a porch, their eyes too old for their faces. I made it to my car, hands shaking so bad I dropped the keys twice. When the engine finally turned over, I didn't look back. I couldn't. I drove until the ocean was gone, until the sky looked normal again. I didn't stop until I hit New Hampshire. I checked into a roadside motel under a fake name, still clutching the map and the journal like they were lifelines. For days, I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that pool and the thing beneath it. I burned the map a week later, tossed the journal into a river. Thought that might help. It didn't. The dreams still come, not every night, but often enough to know it's not over. Sometimes I wake up with sand in my mouth. Sometimes the hum is back, low and steady, just below the edge of hearing. I moved inland, as far from the coast as I could get. Doesn't matter. I still feel the pull. I tried therapy, sleep meds, even neurologist. No one could explain the things I was experiencing without shrugging and scribbling something on a notepad. PTSD, delusions, night terrors. They had names for it, but none of them felt right. I knew what I saw, what I felt, and the worst part isn't that it happened. It's that I know it's still happening. Somewhere out there, in that drowned temple beneath the rocks, they're still singing, still watching, still waiting, and they're not waiting for long. I've tracked the signs in other places, smaller towns along the coast, reports of mass fish deaths, strange disappearances, shared dreams. It's spreading, quietly, like mold under wallpaper. I don't know how long we've got. I don't even know if telling this will help, or just mark me as another lunatic on the internet. But if you've heard the hum, if you've seen the spirals, the eyes, or found animals marked with symbols you can't unsee, get out. Don't go near the water. Don't listen to the chants. And for the love of whatever gods still listen to us, don't follow the maps. I did, and I saw what waits beneath. They call him Cthulhu, but names don't matter. Only the return does. The sea is rising, and he is not dreaming anymore.